Good morning, everybody. This is Julie Richard. I'm the Executive Director of the Maine Arts Commission, and we are thrilled to have Winden Rowe with us today. She is a trauma therapist and public speaker. She's based in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, and she's got quite a background in securing sustained improvement and recovery for clients and organizations dealing with the effects of stress and trauma centers around linking the biological, psychological, and social implications of traumatic stress. I'm sure she's going to tell us what all that means. But mostly she has ties to Maine. She lived in Maine for quite a while and loves Maine and is offering this to us, to all of you, free of charge. So we really appreciate her time today and any help she can provide all of us in dealing with the stress of this coronavirus. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Winden. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So good morning, everyone. My name is Winden Rowe, and yeah, I used to live in Maine, and I had both of my boys there who are now teenagers, home birth midwives in down East Maine, so that was awesome. And the irony of this is that I'm not lying. The second I sat down to log on, it started flurrying outside, and I'm 600 miles south of you, and we usually don't have snow flurries in the middle of April, so I don't know. I guess it's a sign from the universe that I'm right where I'm supposed to be with a bunch of friends and unfamiliar and familiar faces in the state of Maine. And behind me is a trunk with a moose on it that my great-great-grandfather-in-law carved, also from MDI, and a Japanese character that I bought in Ellsworth, Maine. That's the character, I think it's Japanese or Chinese, for love, that was stamped September 10th, 2001. So it was done the day before September 11th, and I purchased that in Maine. So talk about art and how powerful it is. So when I'm not being a therapist and a public speaker, I'm a person like all of you going through the insanely turbulent and sometimes hard to feel our feet on the ground experience of going through this pandemic. I think a lot of us are experiencing waves of all kinds of stuff, and it's hard to navigate that and what that looks like and how to even know what it is that's happening when it's happening. And that's everything from shock and numbness and excitement and joy and gratitude and grief and anxiety and sleeplessness and well-restedness and too much sleep. So there's just a lot going on. And I think a lot of it was going on before a pandemic happened and we had to do this work of staying home. But we had a world where we could distract ourselves. And the other thing that we had was a future, meaning that we could be predictive and have some sense of expectancy and kind of what we call habituate to the likelihood of the next possibility. And suddenly we don't have any of that. And our human minds and our human hearts are going a little haywire. And a lot of that is what I'm going to talk about today. So as Julie mentioned, I am going to be talking about trauma. I'm going to be talking about stress. I'm going to be talking hopefully to all of you as a community of artists and craftspersons around understanding what that looks like for you in your unique culture, and hopefully taking some of what I know from living in Maine and understanding the culture and helping to apply some of what I'm going to talk about to what you might be experiencing in terms of your own experiences, your own wellness, and then also your, I'm sure, considerable fears around the economy of all of this, the financial economy of this and the emotional economy of it. So before I kind of get into the like lecture part of this talk or presentation today, I just want to establish a couple of group norms. One is, if you find that what I'm talking about today or the topic at hand is somewhat irrelevant to you, or you're not finding it useful, there's no harm in signing off and going about your day to do what you need to do. So please feel free to take what you like and leave the rest. You know, self-care first. So just make sure that you're using time wisely. So if you're finding that this isn't applicable, absolutely. If you like what I'm talking about and you're populating questions and your own thoughts and ideas, you know, some norms around that. So if you have a question relevant to what I'm talking to at the time, to the point that I'm speaking to, please absolutely, I think there's a raise your hand feature. I'm not so keen on that one. There's a chat bar. You can chat into that, or you can unmute yourself in a good opportunity and just say, hey, Winden, I have a question. So I like interaction and dialogue when I present, and I'm finding that I like that in a Zoom call. So don't feel like all I am is a talking head to you. I like interaction. So if you want to interact, please do that. If you have a question about something that has come up, I'm going to leave, but that sort of topic has passed or whatever, like a delayed thought, please note what that is. And at the end, I'm going to leave a considerable amount of time for all of us to talk. And just kind of meander through conversation. If you want to hold that to the end, please do. But I ask that any question that we ask on a call like this, especially once a therapist comes into the room, it's really interesting to see some things that have popped up in doing this over the last month. If you feel that the question is relevant to the group, please ask. If it's something that you feel like is very personal and specific to your situation and you want some guidance or feedback on that, my suggestion, and it's been working very well, is to ask me after the presentation in an email. And the best place to do that is to go to my website, which is just my first and last name.com. So I'll spell that out for you if you want to write it down. If not, it's fine. But it's Winden Rowe. It's WINDENROWE. WindenRowe.com. And there's a contact feature, and you can send me anything that you want to share. So again, just keeping whatever we're talking about relevant to all of us if possible. Sometimes I get the like, my sister had this problem question, and there can be a difference between those two kinds of questions, both relevant and important, but just trying to keep it community-based today. And the last thing that I ask is that even though this is largely presentational, we're talking about stress, we're talking about trauma, and we're all people in a very challenging time. I never thought I would see something like this happen in my entire life. I'm still like, oh my God, what? So I like intimacy, and I like connection, and I also like safety. So if there's something that you want to talk about and you feel like this is a safe place to do that, I encourage that and invite that. I also want to establish that we as this community today for this time will honor the privacy of that and keep that here on this call. So if there are any questions about that, let me know. And otherwise, I'll just continue on. And one other piece is I am home with kids, 3 dogs, and a peacock who sometimes comes to the window where I'm working and makes peacock sounds. So if you hear something that sounds like a cat in distress, it's not a cat, it's a big bluebird, but he'll go away. So if there are any interruptions, I apologize. So anyway, I'm going to just talk a little bit about who I am and how I got to where I am, and how Maine actually played a significant role in my professional life. So if somebody had sat me down when I was living where you all are 18, 15, 14 years ago and told me that I would be right here where I am right now, I would have died laughing at the complete insanity of your claim. I wouldn't believe you at all. I was married in my early 20s. I started a family in my early 20s with one of my best friends on the call, was there in the room both times that my babies were born. So I'm eternally grateful to her for that. And I was a mom, and I was running a business and participating in the boom and bust economy of where you are. And I, at the time, didn't even have my undergrad degree completed. And I just was kind of living life. And then all kinds of things happened. And one of the things that happened was addiction came into my family life. That was very challenging. And we went through a lot of trauma. We were a young family that had a best friend who struggled with, we were kind of on the first end of the wave of the opioid epidemic, where our best man in our wedding and best friend, my husband at the time's best friend, got addicted to painkillers, and that turned into a heroin addiction. And he found recovery and he got clean. But he went to a meeting and someone offered him drugs and he accepted them. This was about a year into his recovery. And we had moved back here to Pennsylvania, but we were kind of going back and forth between Pennsylvania and Maine. And the police in Ellsworth called me one night and let us know that they had found him overdosed and he had died in our home. And so that was a significant trauma for me and our family and his family, obviously. And then we went through the loss of someone very close to us and important to us in our family, and then another good friend who took their life not long after that. And so we went through a lot in a very short period of time. And subsequently, that put us on a track that was very different than the track that we had been on. Fast forward, I put myself through school and finished and got my undergraduate degree. I went on to be a public teacher for several years, so I was pretty entrenched in the public school system. And then I went back to school one more time for my master's degree, and I wanted to do counseling work. And I started to recognize that kids go through a lot of stuff we as children do. And I was working with children and had children of my own. And that there was a lot of keep calm and carry on kind of culture and mindset everywhere that I turned. And that happened in Maine, and that was happening in Pennsylvania. And I just kind of, I don't know, these light bulbs started going off. And I realized that one of the gifts that I have is that people liked talking to me. So I just thought, okay, I'm going to go into a counseling degree, because I think teaching taught me that that was a sort of a natural knack of mine. And I ended up finding a program in Philadelphia and enrolling, and I went through one of the only programs in the United States of America right now that is a 100% trauma-focused counseling program. So if you were working with a clinician of any kind and they go to graduate school, they might have a section of their curriculum designated to understanding trauma or teaching about PTSD or what PTSD looks like or how to diagnose it. But there isn't really a lot taught about trauma at all. So I enroll in this program and I get in there and I realize that not only do clinicians not learn about trauma, which is like completely mind-blowing to me, doctors, so every single doctor that you interface with that's a traditional doctor of osteo, that's a DO or an MD, they don't learn about two things in medical school. One is trauma and the other is nutrition. That's the traditional medical model right now in the West. Educators are not taught about early childhood trauma, even though it impacts our accessibility to creativity, synthesis, and learning. And along with the criminal justice system or policymakers, like nobody knows about this thing. But the other track that's running alongside of that is a study that I'm going to bring up, and then before I get into the PowerPoint presentation, which is the largest cross-sectional study done in human population research, at least as far as I know. I don't think it's been replicated yet in these numbers, but a population study that was done where we had 17,000 plus participants, which for anybody who understands research and population research, where it's interactive or questionnaire based, those are very high numbers. And that is something called the ACE study. So people who have what's called an ACE score. So if you don't mind, either a show of hands or you can say yes in the chat box. How many of you have either heard of the ACE study, your ACE score, and or know what that is? So I see a couple of hands. I kind of have to like scroll the screen. So I see just a couple of hands. Okay, so that's promising. I used to give this talk, and or I give this talk a lot, but I would have almost no hands go up. So that's cool. I'm seeing people in the chat replying as well. So for those of you that don't know what your ACE score is, I encourage you to start learning about it. It is probably one of the most important things that I think anyone and everyone can learn about and should learn about. And I truly believe that this information and how we're learning about this original research and re-researching it will change the way that our culture is established. It'll change the way that our government is run if the government decides to be responsive to this information. And the thing that I find so interesting about it is your ACE score teaches us a lot about not just what happened to us or what didn't happen to us, but where our resiliences are, right? And it can also teach us a lot about, in times like this, why we might be struggling the way that we're struggling. So basically what your ACE study is, and I'll pull up an example of it, or your ACE score, I should say, is a 1 through 10 questionnaire that is really easy to find on the internet. So you can just type in ACE, ACE score, ACE questionnaire, ACE study, and something will pop up that looks like this. If I can unhook it from my paperclip. Here we go. And it's just a 10 question questionnaire. So it's questions 1 through 10. And on this side of the paper, there are these blanks where if you have a yes for a response to one of the questions, you would give it a score of a 1. And if it's a no, you would give it a 0. And one thing that I guide people on is if you see one of the questions on the ACE study or the ACE questionnaire, and you feel like, yeah, maybe for a little bit of time in childhood, I'll explain the childhood piece of it in a second, that did happen, but it wasn't significant, it didn't last for very long, then I encourage people to give a half point to it. But basically what your ACE score is kind of a baseline understanding for what early childhood traumas you may have been exposed to. And a lot of people will look at these questions and be like, yeah, that happened, but it doesn't bother me anymore. It doesn't, like, I don't think about it. I don't think about it is what I hear a lot from people. And something that I love that one of my favorite researchers talks about in public speakers, his name is Gabor Mate, is that we can forget that something happened, or we might not think about that something happened, but that we remember, that the body remembers. And there's an ingrained and inborn memory keeping system when it comes to trauma and when it comes to stress that we don't have to have conscious contact with in order for it to exist. We don't have to have consciousness about our traumas in order for them to exist and for them to have an impact on who we are. And that also goes for our stressors. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. I'm going to pause for a second because I see, yes. So adverse childhood experiences. Yes, thank you, Jennifer. And so I'll talk a little bit about what the ACE study is and how it happened, and then I'll pop into the PowerPoint. But the ACE study, again, stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and it came about because in the late 1990s, this is the way that I tell it, the scientists tell it in a little bit more of a sciencey kind of way. But the doctor guys and the money guys at Kaiser Permanente are sitting in a room together, and they're realizing that they're paying out on claims exponentially more so than they had in the past with regard to certain medical health diagnoses that they had not seen in these numbers before, specific to obesity, diabetes, and these were diagnostic onsets in the lifespan at times where we typically didn't see this kind of, we didn't see these diagnoses typically exist in these cohorts. So the question was, why are people getting sick with these illnesses? Why are the bodies presenting in these ways, in ways that we hadn't seen before? And yes, I believe that nutrition and what we do to our food is significant in that. But one of the things that we also learned is these doctors go and they start talking and they come up with a bunch of ideas. And one of them that they started to realize is, you know, this is weird. All of these people that I'm working with are predominant, large majority of them who are presenting with type 2 diabetes, who are presenting with these issues with weight loss, weight gain, obesity, overeating, even diagnoses like cancer, heart disease, autoimmune diseases, are all telling me things about their childhood that are significant. And so what they did was they put together this questionnaire. What they wanted to link was, is it possible that our psychological trauma impacts our physical health and vice versa? And the answer to that is yes. So what we learned from the ACE study is that the higher your ACE score, so the more that you climbed that ACE ladder, the more likely you were to also climb the ladder of diagnostic outcomes with behavioral health, mental health, which I would like to do away with that language altogether because it's all trauma. Rates in incarceration, so increases in terms of incarcerated populations. Addiction. Let's see what else. Things like academic achievement in school, ability to hold and maintain a job, rates of self-harm, and then also our overall wellness. So your ACE score was an indicator that you would be more susceptible to disease, right? So psychological dis-ease manifests as disease in the body. And so what that did was it kicked off what one of my colleagues called the wake up and smell the neuroscience movement, which we are still very much entrenched in, especially here in the city of Philadelphia and just south of me towards Baltimore in Johns Hopkins. They're doing a ton of really cool research right now. And what happened was, a couple of years ago, along comes, actually he was here a long time ago, but along comes this guy and he writes a book, and his name is Bessel van der Kolk. And he writes a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And again, like show of hands or a yes in the chat box if you've heard of him or read this. Ooh, yeah, awesome. So Bessel van der Kolk is one of my favorite guys because he is just south of you in the great city of Boston. And a long time ago, he was doing research with combat veterans. Vietnam veterans, to be specific, and I thank him for that because my father's a two-tour combat vet, air-to-air combat pilot in special operations. And when I was little growing up, I was like, this is really weird. My dad doesn't act like the other dads. What's up with that? But nobody knew what to call it, and nobody had a name for it until I was in college, and then all of a sudden, there was this thing called PTSD. So Bessel is in the city of Boston, and he's sitting here working with these vets, and that starts to become working with women, and that starts to become working with children. And what he starts to realize is that there's something going on in the brain when it comes to trauma. And basically what has happened over time is we are able to look at the brain in real time, like watching a live football game, right? So we can put people in these fancy machines and we can hook up these people to imaging, and we can watch what the brain does as it's doing based on different stimuli that we offer to the individual. So we can offer fear stimuli, we can offer stimuli that offer a sense of comfort and well-being and joy, and then we can look at what the brain does as a result of that. We can look at centers in the brain related to creativity, language, synthesis of thought, even what parts of the brain are doing when it comes to working with memory. And so now all of a sudden we have like a ton of information on our hands. And that becomes very exciting, because what does that mean? We aren't these walking diagnoses that we've been taught that we are all these years. So we're no longer working from, well, the shift is starting to occur, but from a diagnostic model and more from a trauma model, which is very compassionate, it's very human-centered, and it asks the question, what happened, not what's wrong with the person, which allows for all of us to remain whole, whereas we can look at the impact and influence of our experiences. So I'm going to transition into talking about the brain right now. I'm not really, oh, I do have, okay, I have a clock next to me. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions so far? And I know you can jump in and ask anytime, but sometimes it's good to pause.
Winden, this is Julie. The ACE score, what is it? What's the highest score of that? Is it a 1 to 10 scale?
It's a 1 to 10. I have a high ACE score, so we go, depending on the research and the model, typically it's 0 to 3, 4 to 6 or 7, 7 or 8 to 10. So we kind of go like low, medium, high. Mine's on the higher end. My kids is on the higher end. And it's not foolproof. So for example, I worked on a case recently where a person had a 1. And I was like, oh, okay. So they're kind of like on the low end of having had a lot of exposure to adversity. So by the way, these are questions, I forgot to say this. I talk about this stuff all the time, so I just assume that it's all going to come out, but sometimes it doesn't. Oh my gosh, my brain just stopped working for a second. Oh, so this was a person who had a 1, but there were things that had happened to them that don't show up here. So for example, they lost a parent at 6 months old, and then they lost another parent in their early adolescence. There's absolutely nothing on the ACE questionnaire to ask about family death, which is like totally weird to me. They were in foster care at one point, not on the ACE study. It doesn't ask questions about sexual orientation and identity, right? Bullying, which we're seeing a lot of that now. It does ask about suicide attempts, but it doesn't ask about self-harming outside of suicide. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about the original ACE questionnaire, which, I mean, look, they were just figuring this out. We're thankful to them. They didn't ask about, which I think is very relevant, what's called sort of like the generational and epigenetic component of what happened to the people that you came from, right? So we experience our own traumas throughout childhood and then into early adult life and then in adult life. I say at this point, you know, if you get into a room full of people and they're 30 and older and you ask who in here feels like they've experienced something traumatic, everyone's hands are going to go up for the most part. So we don't ask questions in the original ACE about what happened to our parents. But we're born with their DNA, and then their DNA informs us and our development. And our environment can, what we call epigenetically, impact us and what our DNA does with itself throughout the lifespan. So for example, when I have people come in to work with me, and I do a very comprehensive intake, like I spend 2 hours with people every time I work with them for the first time, and it's almost not enough time. I'll ask all about their medical health history. So for example, if I have someone that presents with IBS, Crohn's disease, sort of like in that autoimmune, but we can't figure it out diagnostic world, immediately I'm like, where's the trauma? There's something going on between the brain and the body. So I know I went off on a tangent and into a rabbit hole about that, but yes, it's 1 through 10. It's a yes, no. And it misses a lot. It misses a lot of what we're exposed to. But the ACE score and the ACE study itself has been adapted and readapted so many times that there are more sort of like up-to-date ACE questionnaires that have been populated that are distributed based on like urban environments, or now there's one that you reassess after every couple of years throughout childhood and then after childhood. So they're doing some really cool stuff with it. Any other questions about anything so far? Show of hands if this is like relevant and useful, or like, no, bored out of my mind. Okay. Okay, good. Oh, it's a bored out of my mind. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna, how am I gonna do this? Hold on, I know how to do this. I'm gonna minimize this window and expand on this. I'm not a huge PowerPoint person, but I wanna give you a little bit of stuff to, you're all artists, so some visuals to grab onto. So hold on 1 second. And I'm gonna hit share screen. So you're gonna see my lovely desktop. And now we're going into this guy. So I wanna move into, now that we've talked about ACEs and how it opened up the field of neuroscience, I wanna talk a little bit about neuroscience itself. So when I'm not doing clinical work and I'm not interfacing with people at the office, I teach, and I teach and I publicly speak. They moved all of you somewhere else. Hold on, let me move you back to a place where I can kind of make eye contact with everyone. There we go. So I teach at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and I teach a course called the Neurobiology of Trauma. And what we do is we teach graduate students what happens in the brain and the body as a result of traumatic exposure. And then what we teach are what are called clinical applications. So how do we, once we know that someone is what we call post-diagnostic in the sense that they've already been through the trauma, how do we treat that? And how does the body and how does the brain inform us? And how do we help someone understand themselves? And to me, this is so relevant and so earth-shattering, because referencing back to my earlier life experience, loving someone very much and being involved with someone who was struggling with an addiction, what happened when we went for treatment as a family is they sat him down and they said, you're an addict, you have a disease, you're always going to be an addict, and you know, it's like, it's genetic, like you're born with this thing. Not true. I mean, no harm, no foul. You can't help what you don't know, and you do your best with what you know. And at the time, that's what we believed. And the medical model on addiction has helped a lot of people. But I was sitting there and I was thinking, like, that's not what happened. What happened is this person at a very young age literally brought their mother home from the hospital with aggressive cancer and sat by their bed and watched her die, and was left in a home environment where there wasn't really any kind of nurturing, there wasn't any kind of response. Everyone was traumatized. Nobody knew how to be there for anybody. So there was like a lot of unintentional neglect. And so I'm sitting in this neurobiology of trauma class, and it's like, oh my God, this changes everything. This changes everything, because what the brain does and what the body do are intentional. And it's intentional with the through the framework of wanting ourselves to keep ourselves safe. We have an inborn protector and we have an inborn healer. But if we don't know that and we don't teach that, what happens? It's what happens in my field. We start diagnosing people. We start calling people borderline personality disorder. We start calling them bipolar. We start calling them generalized anxiety or depressed. But none of that is true once trauma comes into the room, you're not a diagnosis. You're someone that has an internal wiring and a mechanism and a structure that's become maladaptive in the sense that it no longer is necessary, but it's still on and operational. Now, I say all of that, reminding myself as I'm speaking that we're in the midst of a pandemic. So the interesting thing for me from a clinical perspective right now is that we're in active trauma. And there's not a whole lot that we can do about it. So one of the things that makes trauma, one of the ways that it's defined is this sort of like lack of control, right? So something that is oppressive or steals our ability to have power and influence, right? To maintain safety. And that's happening right now. And there's not a whole lot that we can do to change that, except what we can do is arm ourselves with information like we are today. And we can also make sure that we're taking steps to minimize the impact of what's happening. So before I advance through the slides, I see there are two. Once I opened up the screen share, it changed my features. So, oh good, thank you. Hold on, now I don't know how to close that. How do I close that? Hold on a second, guys. Sorry. I've decided to learn to be very gentle with myself in doing these things because technology is definitely not my thing all the time. So back to the present moment. You know, I think one of the things that we can ask ourselves as we're waiting through this pandemic time is when we recognize that we're going off kilter, that we're going offline, that we're not feeling safe, that we can ask ourselves, instead of what's wrong with me, we can ask ourselves what's happening, right? So that's kind of one of the first norms that I want to establish, that it's about what's happening, not about what's wrong. And there's another chat, so. Oh, yes, the trauma is active. So why is that relevant? We're going to be talking more from a psychological first aid perspective today, rather than a treatment framework. So right now, one of the things that I find like so ironic, they did not prepare me for this in graduate school. They tried, they did their best. In fact, I'm looking at another book of mine, which is a course that I took on disaster mental health. So my Jefferson office is right next to the offices for, oh my gosh, disaster medicine. And it's kind of funny. It's not funny, it's ironic. And funny can be a good word for it, because if you can't have humor, you know, a lot is lost. But they're all sitting there like frustrated and having a hard time, but there's a little bit of a like, yeah, we told you so feeling coming from that office, because we've known, like in my disaster mental health textbook, which was published in 2007 and then reprinted again, I think it was 2011, verbatim says the United States is woefully unprepared for a pandemic of any kind. So we've known for a long time that should something like this happen, we're not ready for it. And in terms of the clinical side and the treatment side of things, people are coming to me left and right, and they're like, you know, what are we going to do? What's going to happen in the field of mental health? And I'm sitting here going, well, the irony is there's a lot of commentary and news about the field of medicine right now and how compromised we are in that regard. And if you think that's bad, wait till the mental health wave happens, because we weren't prepared to handle the mental health crises we were having before this happened. So someone like me has been working in an opioid epidemic for, you know, gosh, in my personal life, 20 years or whatever it is, and going on a decade or, you know, 7, 8 years in my professional life. So now we have a whole new wave coming, which is all of us, myself included, we're going to have some kind of long-term impact from this. We will. I mean, and it doesn't have to be grave and it doesn't have to be overwhelming, but there will be impact. I do hope very much, and I see the possibility very much for the impact for this to be very good and to facilitate a lot of necessary change. I just don't know if the powers that be, and that goes beyond the executive office, but if the powers that be at large can really understand what we're facing and get behind it. And one of the things that you have to understand, which is hard to understand, it's still hard for me to understand, is that we're still trying to convince people that trauma is a thing and that it impacts a lot of us in a lot of different ways. So referencing back to this ACE questionnaire, that was 1997, and we're still trying to convince people that that research is real, which is like totally bizarre to me. But anyway, all right, so I'm going to move into the slides and just check the chat really quickly. Oh, okay, I'll talk to epigenetics at the end of the chat. It's very cool. So, any questions at the moment? No? Okay, cool. I'm just going to check the time. So something I want to talk about now is the brain. So I want to help you feel like a little bit more brain savvy by the time this is over. And for some of you, this might be repeat information. For some of you, this might be new. So totally cool either way. You know, repetition breeds success, and I always like to learn something new. So for me, this is a win-win. But I'm going to demonstrate some very like baseline kindergarten neuroscience that I wish they would teach in kindergarten using the hand. All right. So this comes from a gentleman named Dan Siegel. Some of you have heard of him. If you're into, you know, conscious parenting and understanding attachment with children, you've likely heard of Dan Siegel. And if you haven't, I highly encourage you to check him out. He's another amazing researcher, writer, presenter, speaker, and he's just got a really like kind, gentle, very compassionate human affect. And he came up with something years and years ago based off of a researcher, named Paul MacLean. So Paul MacLean came along and developed, my gosh, my brain just stopped working, the irony, but a 3-division model of how to break down the brain in a very simple way. And Dan basically took that and translated that into using the hand. I use this all the time. I use it when I'm doing public speaking like this. I work on the government level now, which is like totally bizarre to think that I'm doing that, but I'm part of a think tank for the governor of Pennsylvania on transforming the state into a trauma-informed state. I testified several times for different state representatives for different reasons. And every time I speak to anyone, whether they're a policymaker, a school board person, I use this, and it's powerful, and it helps me remember some of my own stuff when it's coming up. So I'm going to use the hand, and I'm going to talk about what the brain does when it's functional and healthy, okay, let me not say healthy, regulated. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens when stress occurs and trauma occurs, all right? And you're going to hear me talking about stress and trauma side by side a lot, and here's why. And I'll repeat this in a little bit. Stress and trauma are basically like first cousins or even like half siblings, all right? So they're very, very related. So I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more. So using your hand, we're going to talk about the wrist as something called your hindbrain, which houses your brainstem, and then you'll see me fold my thumb into the palm of my hand and my fingers over my thumb. A true brain model will be 2 fists, actually. And for you as artists, this is significant because you're probably much more right-brained versus left-brained. So the right brain is where a lot of our creativity and it's very, it does a lot of synthesizing, and it also houses a lot with regard to our emotions. we're very right brain active people if we're empathic, if we're intuitive, if we're creative, artistic, emotional, expressive. And then our left brainers, which I don't know, I'm a magnet for these people. I gotta like shift gears. But my left brain people are what I lovingly refer to as the robots in my life. So they're very pragmatic, they're very practical people, very science oriented. Life is a spreadsheet. They get around somebody like me who's very feeling and emotional, and they're like, oh my God, I cannot relate. I have no idea what's going on. Very sort of like black-white thinking. And the cool thing about the left brain and the right brain, and the right brain people and left brain people, is we really need each other, right? So the magnetism is there for a reason. It's just learning how to create that balance. And that's an interpersonal relationship, that's an interpersonal experience, and it's also a personal experience in the relationships that we have with people. So the wrist, going back to the brain, is going to represent the hindbrain. So the three major divisions are hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. So your hindbrain, we all have one. If you're on this call, I know that you have a hindbrain, and I know that it's fully operational right now. So this is where our pons and our medulla exist. The brainstem comes into the lower part of the brain, kind of way back in here. And it's working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week before you're born, throughout your entire lifespan, and up until true death, meaning all body systems have now finished their work and there's true complete brain death, right? So your hindbrain is responsible for everything that's automated. And it's connected to what's called our autonomic nervous system, and also wires right into our peripheral nervous system. So this is your central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then the rest of your body, every other neuron is your peripheral nervous system. And it's all connected. And this part of the brain basically just does a lot of relaying back and forth. It sends and receives signals to the body, and then helps do some coordinating in order to pass that information on into the rest of the brain, so the brain can house that and do something with it. It is a completely non-thinking part of our brain. There is no conscious thought that is required for your hindbrain to automate. However, we can apply conscious thought and help do some regulation to this system. So for example, we will breathe automatically all the time, thank goodness, but we can also consciously influence breath. Blinking, I can blink all the time without thinking about it, or I can choose to blink. So there are a couple of different things. Swallowing is another one. I'll swallow when I need to, or I can have that thought and see if I can facilitate that motion. But otherwise, for the most part, it just does its doing. And it also has a lot to do with safety. So there's a lot of safety importance in this non-thinking brain, right? So traveling up from the brain stem, I'm gonna check the time, is our thumb, right? Which houses our limbic system. The limbic system is responsible for emotion, motivation, reward. This is where addiction really has a strong hold. This is where trauma has a lot of power and influence. And the hindbrain and the limbic system will unite and become a force of nature, where their motto and their modus operandi becomes better safe than sorry. And these two systems will work together to keep you alive at all costs, even if that means filling your body with drugs and alcohol. It's very interesting. All right. And these four guys moving away, oh, there's one more thing I wanted to say. So the other thing about the midbrain is that it's what we call pre-verbal. So we can have conscious awareness of it. We can even have conscious influence over a lot of limbic operations. But again, it'll do its doing without necessarily being told. This is more of our mammalian brain, all right? And then this guy here, the fist, or the two fists, become the cortex. So right hemisphere, left hemisphere. And this is where everything human happens, right? So we've got memory, rational thought, language. So up here in the front, we have our ability to produce words, to understand words, to learn those words, to store those words, and to synthesize those words. This is all of your executive functions. So anyone who has a child in school, one of mine is in the next room, who struggles at times with wanting to stay motivated with school and even being excited about school or wanting to do school, there's something going on here where they're not able to have full accessibility to that executive function piece. This is also where relationship happens. There are relational aspects of the limbic system, but this is really the heart of it. This is where self is, right? So, you know, the who am I, the third eye. And when this thing is working together, what happens is the little hindbrain back here goes, oop, here comes something that feels a little threatening. Let's work together. Let's assess this. What do we think? Oh, we're okay. All right, we're good. Onward. However, with stress and trauma, that completely changes. We're going to talk about that in a second. So any questions so far? And I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to try and wrap it up in the next 10 minutes and then move to questions, like dialogue. No? Okay. I barely drank any water yesterday. I'm trying to catch up. Okay, so kind of moving back into the clinical for a second, and then we'll go back into the neuroscience, is one of the things that I think I love most about my field is when people are willing to stand up and be like, no, that's dumb. Why are we doing it that way? It doesn't work. And one of those things is a lovely book that I have somewhere around me called the DSM-5, which there's a professor at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, also known as PCOM, that says the DSM-5 is good for two things: to prop open a window or hold open a door as a doorstop. And I tend to agree. So what we have in that is this manual that teaches us all these diagnoses, and we read it and we observe people, and then we're like, yes, they are bipolar 2 with this feature or whatever. But one of the things that we don't do is we don't talk about trauma, which again is like a big no-no to me. But what we do have in the DSM-5, which I am excited about, is we now have a section on stress and trauma-related diagnoses, or trauma-related diagnoses. So, which is exciting to me because I think the American Psychiatric Association is starting to go like, maybe there's something to this, but they're a little slow to make change. Anyway, the reason I bring up stress and trauma in the same line again is that stress and trauma, and again, things we should teach in kindergarten. Stress and trauma happen in the brain and in the body, so in the brain and the body, using the same parts. So we're talking about hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, and we're also talking about something called the vagus nerve, which I don't think I'll go into much today at all. So same parts, same chemicals. So cortisol, norepinephrine, all kinds of different chemicals and hormones that are released or not released as a result of stress or trauma. But stress is just a smaller dose, and trauma is a really, really, really big dose, or lots of dosing over a long period of time, okay? So one of the things that's happening for us in this pandemic time is we're in a trauma. And whether or not we're experiencing this as traumatic, because many of us are lucky to have jobs or be partnered with someone who hasn't lost a job, we've saved money, we have some kind of stability, and there are others of us that don't have that at all, and we are in constant fight-flight, right? So maybe this isn't being experienced at this point as a trauma for people, but it is being experienced as a stress. So there are people who feel relatively safe in all of the aforementioned, but this is very hard for them to not be able to access the day-to-day. Either way, if you have some kind of history of traumatic stress in your past, and right now you're either re-experiencing this as traumatic or experiencing this as stressful, one will oftentimes interplay on the other. So don't discredit the impact of the day-to-day, either toxic stress or traumatic stress of this in terms of how that might influence or maybe trigger some kind of memories or biological experiences that are uncomfortable. All right. They're all playing in the same sandbox all the time, right? Just one has built a much bigger sandcastle than the other, but it's still sand, it's still sandcastles, and it's the same box. So understand that if there's anything you take away from today, that there really isn't a huge difference. They exist on the same continuum, all right? And that's biological in nature. So what we'll talk about a little bit in a few slides is how to, on a daily level right now, develop some practices around that. So some things to look for if you are experiencing what you perceive to be as traumatic, or if you perceive this time to be stressful or any other stressors in your life. Some things to look for that signal that there is some kind of dysregulation happening in your nervous system, all right? And here's the thing. Recognizing that it's happening and establishing awareness doesn't mean that you have to force change. That can sometimes increase a sense of anxiety, right? So just knowing and understanding that something is happening is sometimes all the safety that you need in a moment. So don't put stress on yourself or pressure on yourself to have to be this like great inner healer. It's not required, but understanding that something's going on and developing a little bit more of some self-compassion around what you see happening for yourself can be very useful. All right, so things to look for are, and this is again that vagus nerve that I quickly mentioned earlier at work. And what it's doing is it's saying to the body, like, all right, everyone on your toes, pay attention because something's not right. Okay, it's that fight-flight response. So things to look for in terms of our body signaling to us are heart rate elevations. If you're having trouble mindfully breathing, if you're having trouble doing anything other than shallow breath. If you recognize that your digestion is dysregulated, people will get like really kind of weird restrictive feelings in their throat areas. So this whole mechanism will do strange things like dry mouth or strange patterns in swallowing or not swallowing, or feeling like you can't get your words out. Changes in our blood pressure typically increases. And then behaviors to look for are increases in substance use. So if you're someone who struggles with substance use as an issue typically, and you find yourself wanting to use more or using more, okay, so what does that tell us? There's more activation in our dysregulation. There's more stress in the body, all right? Looking at sleep disturbances, so that can be not sleeping as much, different sleep patterns, sleeping too much, social withdrawal and isolation, and we're going to talk about that one as a community more, I think. And then irritability specifically and racing thoughts. So anger and anxiety are what I call head emotions. So these are things that are coming from here. Grief and love, compassion, even sadness is a little bit different to me than grief, but those are usually heart-based, right? If you're recognizing that you're doing a lot of anger, you're doing a lot of snappiness, you're doing a lot of racing thought, it's more brain-based stuff. So you can recognize if that is the case, that again, there's something happening for you where you're not feeling safe, and recognizing what that might be, okay? All right, can advance forward. Any questions? Okay, so we're gonna look a little bit at, I might just decide to skip through this slide because I wanna make sure, I mean, I'll just touch on it quickly, but I wanna make sure to wrap it up in a couple minutes. Again, if all you do right now is focus on just what you notice is happening for you, that's more than enough. And you don't even have to do that. You can do what we're good at and is useful many times in life, which is to just set it off to the side. We call that repression, we call that suppression, and that's okay, right? Repression and suppression have a very important place. They're good safety features, but again, they also play out sometimes too long. So just recognize, like, maybe right now what I'm going to do is what I've done in the past and just shelve this and just see if I can, like, almost sort of dissociate from what's happening, and do that in a way that feels kind of safe. But, you know, kind of like, I'll deal with it later. That's okay. Lots of people choose that path. But if that doesn't sound appealing to you, just, again, like a check-in, you can even use that. You can use this earlier list. You know, are these things that I notice that I'm doing on a daily basis? Where can I get some help and support around this? All right, so just a couple of quick tips, and I'm going to talk about why each one of these is good for us as we're looking at this through the mental health first aid lens, so reducing the impact of the trauma. Right now, going back to this model, what happens when these two guys back here, this hindbrain and this midbrain, this better safe than sorry mechanism kick off, what happens is they become the muscle strength of the central nervous system, right? And in fact, what even happens in that two hemisphere model is that left logic side really starts to quiet down, and that right reactive side really starts to pick up and become overactive, right? And so what happens is, the more that we play on that, later on down the road, there's a little bit more work to do to bring these two things back together, right? And so again, this can just be impact reduction mindset. So what happens is, when these guys start taking off, we flip our lids. So what happens in those sort of like real-time TV shows that I told you about with the brain is we see a deactivation in the cortex when we either experience stress and trauma or we re-experience toxic stress and trauma, all right? And so what's happening is that hindbrain back here, that automatic piece that's communicating with the body, and that limbic piece that has to do with our emotions is overactive, and this is underactive. So what we want to do is not focus necessarily on becoming rational in those moments, but becoming regulated, right? It's not about rational, it's about regulation. And so one of the best ways to do that are pieces that I have on the board here. One is breath work. So again, we can influence what brainstem activity does by doing different breathing techniques. One that I teach that is very easy and simple to do, and I try and do it twice a day right now, but it's just a couple of minutes of breathing in through your nose like you're smelling roses, and then breathing out like you're blowing bubbles for a small child. So you want to blow slowly and gently for a longer period of time. And what that does is that activates a part of our peripheral nervous system called your parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest feature. And everyone on the planet right now is parasympathetically compromised. So breath work twice a day, a few minutes a day, is a huge gift to yourself if you can remember to do that. Yoga. A lot of people, when I teach yoga, are like, that's for suburban, you know, basic white moms who play soccer and get Starbucks. Not true. Yoga can be done even with double amputee, triple amputee combat veterans, right? So we just have three primary features to yoga, which is breath, which I just talked about, asana, which is moving the body, and stillness. So there's a meditation piece. Again, that will help stimulate parasympathetic nervous system activity. So just simple, you don't have to be a yogi. Simple stretching, gently moving the body, being in the body, activating the body, waking the body, or helping the body experience calm is a great tool. There are tons of free resources online right now. I'm almost finished. The third is anything based in grounding and or movement. I'm promoting movement right now. Most of us are probably experiencing an overabundance to varying degrees of cortisol and norepinephrine. Cortisol is misunderstood as the stress hormone. It's actually the hormone that helps regulate our stress response, and our stress response will pump adrenaline, what we call norepinephrine, into our systems, right? So anything that you can do to move is critical. Here's why. That fight-flight response with that reptilian and that mammalian brain system, animals, when they're scared, they fight the thing off or they run away from it. We don't do that. And we need to do that. That's why we see those high rates of diabetes, obesity, all those negative health outcomes. It's because we just sit and marinate in our own toxic stress juices. Not good. So get up and move your body. And then the last piece, and this is the most important piece, and I think especially in the state of Maine, is social connection. So having lived in Maine, I know social isolation and the ability to kind of get away from people is easy to do in and of itself, and it predominantly throughout the state. But my recommendation now more than ever is to combat that. So to have a plan to every day connect, whether that's on a call like this, picking up the phone and talking to a friend, meeting for a safe social distance walk, but giving yourself an important space to be able to process what's going on. So on that note, I'm gonna just hop off the presentation train here and go back to a full screen of all of my Zoomers. And, oh, that's really weird. How do I get out of that? Hold on. Sorry, my whole screen just went black. There we go. Okay. So let me I'm going to start with, if anyone has any questions. Sometimes when I say that, the room's like really awkwardly quiet for a long period of time, so you might not have questions. So two other things are, did you hear anything that felt relevant to you, useful, exciting, and do you as a community member just want to share how you're feeling right now? I mean, any or all of the above. So we can take this wherever you want to go. And I'll stop talking. Oh, okay. I was wondering if that was I think, can you all unmute yourselves, by the way? Or do I have to do that? You should see on your window a little feature where it says mute or unmute in your little window. So feel free to jump in. I see a text chat from, how can we talk to our employers about needing more time flexibility or reduced workload in order to better deal with the current situation? I don't know, Kara, if I can ask you a follow-up question, but can you tell me a little bit about what line of work you're in? If you're not comfortable doing that, that's okay. Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I have the benefit of working for a university where they seem to understand that this is a real issue, so we've been given a lot more flexibility. Have they addressed it with you at all? And I guess I would ask, is anyone else on the call having that same problem with employers not being responsive to the changing needs and the demand of this time? Yeah, so here are my thoughts on that. I don't know if you're part of, some universities have either associations or unions, and what I've learned is the more voices that are coordinated saying the same thing or similar thing at the same time tends to be more effective than one voice at a time. So if there's a way that you can, as a group, coordinate getting together, and I would say the other thing is to be solution focused. So one thing that I've found, which is so interesting, is a lot of employers, I don't know why, like, it's kind of like, again, the same thing, like march forward, this like keep calm and carry on kind of mindset. And that's causing a lot of stress for people. So I would say if you can either through an association or through a group of coordinated employees who are experiencing the same thing, ask for a dialogue around that. I would start there. And then I was feeling guilty about selling art and even offering it, wondering how art affects the community health. And artists, roles as artists. Okay. Yeah, so here's my take on this. I think that you're needed now more than ever. What that need is gonna look like, I can't say for sure, but I can say the following things is people are home, they're bored out of their skulls and they're desperate for someone or someone's to teach them, to do cool online interactive. I mean, there are people online learning all kinds of things, which is really unbelievable. So if there's a way that you can promote yourself and your skills online, I would absolutely do that. And no shame. I also have some concerns about the economy and what the big picture is going to be able to provide for communities. So I would say, you know, if you have a skill, I have a feeling that there's a time coming where that's going to be needed. I mean, that's been my thought and my mindset around this for a long time. What that looks like, I can't anticipate, but I don't know about what's happening in Maine, but I know one thing that's happening in our community is that a lot of people are rallying around our local artists, and we're wanting to keep that part of our community thriving. Have you noticed that happening in Maine, or is that not the case?
Somewhat. I feel like there's a little bit of that going on. I feel like there could be, I definitely think the funding organizations and as a group, as each other we are, but I think there's, you know, as people are very desperate and feeling stressed themselves, it's not, we're not all connecting as much as I'd like. It might also be that we're all inside. I don't know. I don't know how other people feel about that.
Is that something that you are experiencing is a lack of connection as a community? It's okay to talk. I like talking. Maybe this is representative of what's going on. Is there's not enough dialogue? Maybe you're just like putting it right out there in front and center for me to see. Is this part of it? Is kind of a little wave of introversion is happening? Is that?
Can you hear me? This is Susan.
I hear you, Susan.
I had sort of an interesting experience in relation to connecting and, you know, kind of how to get out there, where someone sent me a photo of a sign that was a big banner that was in England, and it said, "Love is not shut down." And the zero, the O in love was a big red heart, and the rest of the sign was in black. And I just thought that was like so crazy profound. And so I actually called Coca-Cola in Maine here and asked them if, you know, they make banners for different causes, if they would make a banner for me about that so that I could put it up in my town. And I said I had connections with the governor's office, and I bet there would be a lot of people who might like that banner. And I just kind of got all excited about it. It would be something positive to say. This was about 2 weeks ago, especially when it first got more serious. But, you know, I talked to my town office, and because we also have a billboard where we could have that sign, you know, put. And basically, you know, there was hardly any place that it would be able to be put up. I would have to deal with a private business who would be willing to let me put it up, and, you know, and so on if I had a banner made. And which I thought was kind of interesting, because you got just kind of met with this bureaucracy. And then basically Coca-Cola has not responded to my inquiries. As far as I can tell, they're not going to make it. Like it was too far beyond their comfort zone, which was kind of painfully telling in its own way, because to me, it's so shockingly beautiful and cuts across everything.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, I felt like the desire to be a guerrilla artist, and yet, though our local post office said, just, I don't know anything about it. You know, if I have to take it down, I do, but, you know, let me know when you put it up. You know,
Yeah.
they were happy to have me put it up, but basically, I don't think Coca-Cola is even willing to go there, which I thought was, it speaks to the whole sort of cultural challenges we're having right now, as far as being open to art and love and going forward and equality.
What if you all as a group started a campaign in the state that says love and art are not shut down? I don't know. But maybe you don't need Coca-Cola to help you. Maybe you do that together as artists. And that becomes, I mean, look, nobody knows what's going to happen. So at least we can do is do something and try, right? And that becomes the question, is like, where do you want to put your effort? And, you know, something that has helped me is learning to stand back up every time I hear the word no. I do a lot of writing, and a friend coaxed me to submit a piece to the New York Times, and they wrote yesterday, and it was a good piece, but it wasn't right for them for what they were looking for. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop trying because I heard no. And so I would say, let that become your mindset. Is look, there's one thing, going back to that ACE score, you know what else that ACE score teaches you? That you're adaptive, and that you know how to survive, and that you know how, when you hit a roadblock, to go around it, over it, under it, or through it, right? So if you survived any of that stuff, something in you has taught you how to adapt. And tap into that. Like, how do you adaptively as an individual, and with community? We need community. We heal in community. We say that trauma happens in isolation and healing happens in community. So how do you find your voice and figure out how to be there for one another? And it won't be perfect, but you do your best. And there's a lot happening in the chat. I don't know if I'm going to keep up with it. So if you have a question that you typed into the chat that I might not be seeing, just unmute and ask if you don't mind, because I'm like, one, I'm not wearing my glasses. That's helpful. Go ahead, Julie.
I have a question. You said you were going to talk a little bit about the ACE score and ability to be resilient. How are they relevant?
So kind of tapping into what I was just talking about. So something that I do with all of my clients when we're talking about post-trauma treatment is I have all of my clients do a timeline. Well, I would like them to. Some of them I've been working with for 2 years, and they leave my office every time. They're like, gonna do that timeline, they never do it. But what the timeline is basically like you would timeline in elementary school, the Revolutionary War or whatever. And I have them in 5-year increments. And by the way, I always do on myself what I ask my clients to do. It's a lot. It's a lot. So every 5 years in increments, you note relevant life experiences that were either very challenging, traumatic, hard, and then also successes and wins, because those are important things to point out. And then also, what was your resilience to get through what you got through? So the ACE will show us what happened, right? But there's another question that we can ask behind that, which is how? How did I get through that? How did I get through that? And that might be forgetting, right? Like I talked about, like that, like repressing, the shutting down, the suppressing, useful tool. Who needs to have that as a skill? Veterans. Can't do it. Police officers can't do it. First responders in medicine can't do their job if they don't know how to suppress. Trauma therapists. I have to learn how to put some stuff away. I have to. There's no freaking way I could do my job if I didn't have that as a skill. So there's resilience in that. But there's also a place where it becomes maladaptive, which is if I'm repressing and suppressing my entire life. It's kind of a problem. I'm going to affect the people around me if I'm not self-aware. So that question, how, when it comes to the ACEs specifically, if you are in front of me today and you're alive, look, I did 2 years in the hospital with active heroin users who were trying to get clean. They got to me. They were in front of me. They have resilience. And what does that look like, and where's that coming from? Hold on, I'm gonna peek out my window really quickly. I heard my peacock. He's been going to my neighbor's house and he's not supposed to. So,
Peacocks.
normal stuff around here. Let me take a look. Yeah. So again, I see the chat's going, but I don't know. I see Heidi has a hand up. Go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, I first of all, I want to thank whoever has put this together. I guess it's the Maine Arts Commission, and I'm really grateful that you're coming in. I would like to know, do you know about Music Cares?
Yes.
And
Cares?
Music Cares, it's the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences support network that they have. They do the big grant, like Artist of the Year award, that, and they're, what I learned about from them is at first was through a music. I went to Berklee College of Music, and I went to the New England Music Organization's NEMO conference, and they are a group that's very dedicated towards sobriety and helping to provide health resources to musicians in times of need. And they also provide a sober room for musicians backstage at the Grammys, and so that people have a place to go that doesn't have alcohol and stuff. And the thing that I'm thinking of while you're talking is about how we can set up like a PBS or like a Music Cares type of a program that can support us going forward. I mean, we're making huge like paradigm shifts as we're going through this time. So why not think big about the ways that we as artists are supported, and not just talk about just music performance, but actually have like a support network that provides not just like healthcare for all musicians and artists, but also provide a way that musicians and artists can be supportive without having to buy in to the regulations that are put forward, the restrictions and rules that people have to abide by when they do like an American Idol or a Voice or whatever to win those contests. I'm sure you've got to like abide by certain like contestant rules and stuff, but how can we think about ways that we can provide sustenance so that musicians and artists can really sustain their careers without having to sell their souls out to coke and that sort of thing?
So
And
let me, in the two things I want to ask, because I'm watching the clock, is I have extra time. So if anyone wants to stay on the call after noon, I think I have it set to close at 12:15. So we don't have to hop off at noon. If you need to hop off, go ahead. So hopefully I can answer the question, because it sounds like it has a couple of different pieces to it. But, you know, I think the change, and let me say this, working at the state level, at the governor level, I'm learning a lot very quickly. And I've been learning this along the way, working with state reps. And also corporations, you know, like Ogilvy, I just did a talk for. JP Morgan Chase is, we're going back and forth about me doing a training for them. They move differently, they think differently, and they act differently. And to I think the movement is going to become grassroots. I think that's really where it's sort of like the true rebellion is. And again, my suggestion, and that's kind of on that last slide, and I'll say it again and again, is, you know, what are the ways that you as artists under an umbrella like this association through the state can pull your resources? Because here's the thing about all of this safety and healing stuff is it's not that complicated. So when I really sit down and draft a treatment plan with someone, like an individual, and this also applies to systems, it's having wellness, right? So having day-to-day self-care and wellness in our bodies and wellness in our hearts and wellness in our minds and community. And that's where our healing is going to happen here as a globe, as a town system, as a county system, as a state system, as a national system, as an international system, as a family system, is wellness, and then community, right? So if you're wanting those things, are you able as a collective to put that together? So for example, you mentioned recovery. Well, recovery is really hard to access right now, but you know, there are online, there's something called, I'll say it backwards. It's either Dharma, no, it's Dharma Recovery Dharma. Shoot, I keep reading it, but I can never remember. But it's a new recovery based in Buddhist thought. So it's stepping away from that 12-step tradition. Like these things are being established and they're being formed, but we can also form them ourselves. And I don't know if that helps answer the question all the way, but if you're knocking on the door and people aren't answering, is it something that everyone can open their doors to each other at the same time? And I will say this, here's one thing that I found very common as a theme in Maine is that, this isn't, you keep in mind, I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, but one of my experiences moving there is I would say to myself, community up here is kind of like the weather. It's a little cold and it's a little isolating, but that doesn't mean that people aren't warm and lovely. I mean, some of my best friends are up there and I call Maine my home away from home. I miss it a lot. And I'm thrilled that my son wants to go to school there. Thrilled. But there is a need for Maine as a community, and it's been there for a long time, for more effort around that. I think this is a time when I think this pandemic, one of the things that it's calling for is togetherness. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. This is an opportunity to change to change the norm. I see Susie with a hand, and I hope I answered your question, Heidi.
Sort of. Can I just chime in with just a couple more things?
How about,
one?
Can you do one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that I feel like you kind of missed a little bit of the point, and that is that I was thinking about having a nationally based, like socialized support system for musicians and artists that would be an income, a way to do a national Patreon type of a thing so that artists can just focus on their art and living.
Heidi,
so
how about,
it's a larger discussion to have.
yeah,
I understand that. But
it is.
I'm just planting the seeds of that because I think that we need to be discussing this because there are other countries that do allow their artists to be supported by just their doing their art. And
so
I think
I'm gonna again, in the interest of time, that
right.
I don't want
let's
to
get
go
to
too off
Susie's
course.
question.
Yeah,
Thank
but
you.
this would be a great thing to send me in an email because they might be able to point you in the direction of people who, I didn't realize that you were talking on a national level. I thought you meant on a state level. So send me an email through my website and I might be able to point you in the direction of some resources around that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Susie.
Hey guys, Yeah, this was awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm a huge believer in self-care. And you know, like I'm going to share this in hopes that like it might help someone who's having a hard time out there. But when I get up in the morning, like before I start thinking about who else I can help, like I need to take care of myself first. Like I do journaling, I do meditation, I do prayer. I pray. I'm spiritual. I'm not religious, but I do believe that there's a higher good. I believe that there's something has happened. This is happening for a reason. And as far as like community goes, like it's my responsibility to reach out. Like this was like sent to me in an email, and I was like, you know what? This sounds like a great thing to do during my workday. You know, like I don't know, like I try to look at the positive in all this, and like and there was a day this week where I was not seeing it, and like it's okay, like I need to like forgive myself, right? I need to like know that this is a big deal and this is happening worldwide, and like it's not just happening to me, it's happening to everybody. But if I take care of myself first, then that's when like my day goes better and I can reach out to other people and be more available. Because if I don't have that self-care, because I was doing I did the ACE report, the test, and I'm an 8. Like I got some stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, you know, but like I do a lot of self-care and stuff like that, and I tend to look at that stuff as like not like I don't want to look at myself as a victim, but like I want to feel empowered by those things that happened in my life, you know, like
Totally.
it's not things that happened to me, it happened, right? Growing up with a mom with mental illness, it happens, you know, it just, and it's like it's okay, you know, but like how am I going to make a difference in my life and like my life's purpose? Because I don't know, I really appreciate this whole thing. I hope that helped. Journaling is helping me big time. Meditation, beautiful. Like take the time for yourself. There's a lot of yoga apps out there. Like I do one called Down Dog that's free for like all educators right now. And you can set it to any level you want. You can do a super gentle yin yoga, which is just like you're lying on the floor and you're twisting. And it's like so gentle, and like just be gentle with yourselves and give yourself a break. So
I say put your own oxygen mask on first. That's how you best help others.
yes.
And you know, I'm so glad you said what you said, because here's the deal. I just want to take a quick look and make sure I'm not totally messing up my calendar. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm good. This time is unprecedented. So for the first time in the history of humankind, we get to write history. There's no way to repeat history because this has never happened before, where the whole world, everybody went home. Like, it's so bizarre. So don't discredit that. Like tuck that away in your human heart and think about that. Like when you find the space to think about it, and don't discredit. I love that you use the word forgiveness. And I think I saw Randall put a hand up. I'm going to come to you next. You know, don't discredit that it's hard sometimes being a therapist in this, because I think people are like looking at all of us like, tell us what to do. We're kind of going like, I don't know, we're figuring it out just like you are. But here's one thing that you can do is regulate, right? Like self-regulate, do that work around regulation, because it's only a matter of time before somebody reaches out and says, I'm not okay. And then you can share a little bit of what you have learned that helps you. And part of this, I feel like, is we make it up the ladder and then we come down the chute. So recognize, I think there's some cyclical nature to how we're going to keep moving through this. But I have to say, every time I get on a call like this and people get into a virtual room, and we talk through what's going on, it's like, it's a huge exhale. So I would recommend that if you as a group of artists can come together and talk, and you have to be mindful of, you know, like we talked about, like keeping it safe, time boundaries around sharing? Is it relevant to the group? Is it not relevant to the group? Is it a discussion for after the group? You know, so, but why not? And Randall, I want to make sure I get to you. I think you had a question. Unmute. I'm going to unmute you. Wait, unmute. I don't know if I can.
All right, I think I just did.
Yeah, there you are.
Something I noticed that's happening to me, and I understand and I hear what you're saying, and I think that's good advice, and I'll try to be mindful of that. Kara Joyrun, I put that out in the chat before, but it's like I'm experiencing a kind of paralysis. I have the thought, yes, I should get going and do something. Yes, I should do something, self-care, whatever it is. But I find this kind of paralysis has been happening. And it's just, as Kara had asked in her chat piece, you know, do you have any advice to combat those feelings? You know, how do you deal with it when you have the thought, you know, you should be doing something constructive or something, you know, not necessarily to produce a piece of art or something like that, but just doing something, get up, get dressed, something like that. But you have this feeling, this paralysis that it's almost like next thing you know, it's 2:45 in the afternoon and you still haven't done anything.
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that question. And as I said, if someone asked something in the chat and I didn't see it, emceeing gets a little tricky between reading and thinking and talking. But so there are a lot of F's that I didn't go into with the trauma response, and they are the following. We have a fight response, we have a flight response, and we also have a freeze response. So if you are feeling immobilized, again, that's nothing's wrong with you. That has been, I would venture to say that that is a way that you learned to stay safe at some point in your life, right? That either in childhood, you learned to stay very still and make no motion because you didn't want to rock the boat of the caregivers around you, or you experienced some kind of trauma in your life at some point where you, again, were in an unsafe environment and doing absolutely nothing was the best way that you could stay safe. So what does that mean? It means that your nervous system is working, right? Some of the other F's are feed responses. So what we're doing with food changes when we're stressed out, because the body's saying like, oh, SHIT, what's going to happen next? Am I going to run out of food? So we'll either hold on to food, we'll pack on weight. Some of us might have more eating disorder tendencies where we stop eating altogether. Well, I don't like the word eating disorder, so strike that from the record. Dysregulated eating tendencies. We start doing weird things with our finances. That's another F. We start doing strange things with our sex responses, which is another F. Ha ha ha, that's a funny joke that my colleague tells. Fidget. So people who are ADHD or children who are diagnosed as ADHD, 99% of the time I say there's some kind of toxic stress or trauma going on with that individual. So if you're experiencing a freeze response, it means that your body is signaling to you that there's a lack of safety. There's something about this experience where you don't feel safe, which is normal and okay. And the question is, can you do some kind of radical acceptance around that and some self-compassion where it's like, okay, right now, I'm doing a freeze response because that's what my body tells me to do and I'm scared. That's what I learned to do to stay safe from where I came from. So I'm going to give permission for that, but I'm going to do a little bit of accountability. So I'm going to do like one thing a day where I know I'm going to do something to connect. Like I'm going to text a friend, or I'm going to ask a friend to text me every day. I'm going to call someone, or I'm going to ask them to call me every day. Or maybe I'll let myself be totally frozen until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But at 2 o'clock, I'm going to see if I can create a little bit of structure from 2 to 4. And then I'll go back into freeze mode again. So it's not trying to change whatever is in place, but recognizing that it's happening for a reason. And the reason is your body wants you to stay safe. And what I'll say to that, Randall, is that in and of itself is its own oxygen mask. So if your stress response in your body system says, stop everything. This is how we know how to best get through something like this. That's your own version of self-care. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're comfortable with it. And so to start there with the dialogue, right? I don't know about anybody else in the room, but when someone, including myself, comes at me with like, you have to change, that's when I'm like, yeah, right. It's like the shutdown. The judgment shuts down the process. So can you develop a little bit of a framework around self-compassion? I'm doing this for a reason. This is what my body does because my body wants me to be safe.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And that's very, at least I can feel an energy coming through right now, just having been validated that it's happening. So that's a good thing. And I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure. Any other? I've just got a couple of minutes left, and this might be a good place to get close to wrapping up. If there's anyone who is like, I wish I had asked, or I wish I had said something, not too late. And again, epigenetics. Yes, thank you. So let me see if I can do epigenetics in 2 seconds or 2 minutes or 5 minutes. For anyone who's interested in learning more about this stuff, there's a really great free online podcast series called On Being, which many people have heard of. It's a woman named Krista Tippett, and she typically explores the realm of like the spiritual life, not necessarily religion, which I think Susie had mentioned earlier, but spiritual. So like, who are we? What are we doing here? Why are we here? And she interviews the gentleman who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, and I'll text that into the chat. His L is, it's all one L, Bessel, Van der Kolk. And she interviews another woman named Rachel, Chal, Yehuda. And it's On Being. So if you do On Being in your Google search, and oh, great, there you go. Thank you, Susie. So 2 free podcasts, and Rachel Yehuda, I have a, there's a term that I learned in the last couple of years called, when you're a sapiosexual person, it means that you get turned on by intelligence. And I identify as a straight person, but I have an academic crush on Rachel Yehuda, and I have an academic crush on Bessel van der Kolk and Gabor Mate. So it doesn't matter if you're a male or a female or a non-binary person. If you're super smart and into this stuff, I just think you're so cool. But so Rachel Yehuda is my academic girl crush, and she is a researcher who has done a lot of really cool stuff. But one thing that she looked at was generational trauma in individuals who come from family patterns of Holocaust survivors. And so what she wanted to look at was people who had, most likely biologically in their DNA, someone who survived significant trauma and what we call complex trauma. So complex trauma is how we identify, what we identify as the complete oppression of one force on an individual. So that can be governmental, it can be any and all kinds of things. It can be individual to individual in terms of, you know, being kidnapped and sequestered and that kind of thing. So in a way, we're going through that right now to a certain extent. And I'm going to keep us going. I just got a message that the person I'm supposed to talk to is running behind. So that's serendipitous. So what she looks at is how the DNA plays like a keyboard, right? So we're born with the DNA from our parents and our parents' parents and our parents' parents and our parents' parents. So we're like these nesting dolls for all of these people that came before us. And if we think life is traumatic now, rewind 150 years ago before we had medicine, like talk about traumatic and the kinds of traumas that people sustained and survived. So we have in us all of that trauma and the memory of it, like the cellular memory of it, it's in the DNA. We also have the resilience. And what she looks at is how does life and stress and environment, basically open up that double helix and play on the keyboard like, well, basically as if the trauma in the real time is kind of touching on the trauma that maybe we inherited from our parents. And it gets far more complex than that. So for example, there are studies now where we look at women who are pregnant. So I was, and one of my best friends signed off, but she and I both had September 11th babies, right? So we were expecting, she had just had her daughter a few days before September 11th, and I had my son 6 weeks after September 11th. So we were like pickled in that toxic stress from that trauma. So now there's a lot of research to look at how even when we're in utero, the stress of the mother affects our susceptibility, resilience, and adaptability to the trauma, and how that is playing on the DNA, either from the past and in real time. I hope that helps answer the question on a baseline. There's so much, you guys. I teach an entire, like, you know, semester-long course on this, so I'm trying to give you like snippets, but anything else I can, and the classroom's dwindling, so it might be a good time to sign off. Here's what I'll say is, again, if you have any questions or follow-up questions, you can go to my website. Again, it's my first and last name, so I'll take that in, windenrowe.com. And I'm active on Instagram. My Instagram is, I write a couple of pieces at a time and leave them up, and then I archive them. I'm in the process of putting a book together. And then on Facebook, and, you know, I'll post if I'm doing an event. Every Wednesday at noon, I'm doing a free Zoom call for anyone who wants to hop on. There are people from all over the country that hop on, and we just kind of talk and see how everyone's doing. So I think that's it. I think this is the part where I'll sign off. If anyone has anything to say.